So this video I'm going to give the basics of two-dimensional arrays, and it's a hard concept for some students, so you may need to watch this a couple times just to remind yourself kind of how things work. And Java, like most computer programming languages, support multi-dimensional arrays. So we've already talked about one-dimensional arrays. And then, of course, there's two-dimensional and three-dimensional arrays. However, three-dimensional arrays are not tested on the AP exam, so we really don't care about them. We're going to talk about two-dimensional arrays. And this is best used when the data is best represented in rows and columns or has two variant aspects like gender and age, weight and height, etc. And usually it kind of looks like a spreadsheet when you create a two-dimensional array. So and how do we create a two-dimensional array? Well, it'll look very familiar. If we wanted to create an array with 4 rows and 10 columns, it would look like this. If these were all integers, right? Int, square brackets, square brackets. So when we made a one-dimensional array, there was just one square bracket, and a two-dimensional array has 2 square brackets. I'm calling it A. And then I say how many rows, rows comes first, and then how many columns. Rows, columns. So this has 4 rows and 10 columns, and if we were going to visually be able to see this, it would kind of look like this here, where here's row 0, row 1, row 2, row 3. See, there are 4 rows, even though it counts to 3. And here's column 0, column 1, all the way up to column 9. There are 10 columns. And if I wanted to access a specific spot in the array, so like this spot right here, is A square brackets 3, square brackets 7. Why? Well, it's row 3, that's the 3, and it's column 7, that's the 7. And that would access this spot in my spreadsheet or in my two-dimensional array. So really an array, a two-dimensional array is an array of arrays. So if I had an array that was 5 rows by 4 columns, really what it is an array of 5 rows that holds an array of 4 numbers. So really this first row is just a reference to an array, and it's pointing at these other arrays. So you can remember it like that, or you can remember it that it's just a spreadsheet style two-dimensional array that has a certain number of rows and a certain number of columns. And then when we're writing for loops, we always need to know the length of the array, right? We know that if I took the length of this array, this small one right here, that it would say 4. So how do you find the length of a two-dimensional array? Well, it's actually 2 steps here. If you take the length of nums, this is nums.length, it equals 5. It always gives you the rows first there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It gives you the number of rows. So then how do you find the length of the number of columns? Well, you have to find the length of any one of the rows. So if I say nums square bracket 0, nums square bracket 0 is this spot right here. And then it looks, and what's the length of nums square bracket 0? Well, there's 4 things in there. So there's your length of 4. And that's your number of columns. So just remember, to get the rows, it's nums.length. To get the columns, it's nums square bracket 0.length. And actually, you can choose any one of the rows, right? And I have 5 rows, so I could choose nums 0, nums 1, nums 2, nums 3, nums 4. They all have the same length. There's all a size 4 array in each of the rows. But just always put 0, because it's always gonna work here. So the length of the rows is nums.length. The length of the columns is nums square bracket 0.length. Now let's look at how a for loop traverses through a two-dimensional array. Here I've got a two-dimensional array of integers, and we'll put the indexes on here, 0, 1, 2, and 0, 1. So I have column 0, or sorry, I have row 0, row 1, and I have column 0, 1, and 2. And to get items out of here, we need a nested for loop. And what that is two for loops kind of nested together. My first for loop is the rows. I make my integer r to remind me that it's rows. And remember, it's the length to get the number of rows. It's my array dot length. So let's assume this is called my array. Then the inside, I have the columns, and I put C for columns, and the length of the columns is my array square bracket 0 dot length. The next thing is when I access the array, it's rows and then columns. Very important. I kind of tried to put the blue number for my rows and the red number for my columns. Now let's see what happens when I try to loop through this here. What happens to R and C? Well, the first time through here, my row, we're going to figure out what this current value is too. So the first time through, my row is set to 0. That's where it starts. And then let's see what happens with that 0. Well, it's going to go here into my array because that's where R is. R is 0, so that's going to go there. Now let's look at the columns. Well, the columns start at 0 as well, so that's going to be 0. And that value is going to go in here. So now I'm accessing my array 0, 0. Well, what is my array 0? The 0th row and the 0th column is that number 5. So when I try to access the current number, well, right now that's 5. Okay, so next, what happens? How does this traverse the array? How does it go through? Well, it stays on this inner loop until it finishes. So my rows are going to stay at 0 until I get to the end of my columns. When I get to the end of my columns here, my row is going to go down to 1. So watch that. My columns is going to change here to 1. That's going to go in here, and then I'm at 0, column 1, and the value is now 7. Next time through, C changes to 2, my second column here. It's going to go in here, and then what is 0, 2? Well, that's the number 1 there. So now I've finished off my columns, right? And I just took that out for the time being because this loop is done. I need to go back to my for loop of my rows here. And the rows was at 0. Now it's at 1. So this is going to change to 1. So once I come back up here and go through this loop again, my columns loop starts over. It already went from 0 to 2 once. Now it's actually going to do it again. It gets to start over because the code is being reread. I went through this loop, looped however many times, and then it came back up to this loop, and then my columns loop restarts from 0. So that's 1, 0. And what is 1, 0? Well, that's the value of 2 there. And now this columns loop is going to finish like it did before. So row 1, column 1, the value of that is 0. And then finally row 1, column 2, the value is 9. So hopefully you understand kind of how the for loop works. You start with this number, but then this loop finishes. When you come back up and get another number for the rows, the columns loop goes again. And that's how it works. If you need more help on it, watch this video again or come and ask me for help. And that is it.